Hello, I'm here. I'm just doing all the logistics stuff. I'm putting this also on the LinkedIn page. So you're the first YouTube lecture post on LinkedIn. Woo.
Oh my God. I have some people that I said I would send the link
I'm
to.
here. I'm just doing all the logistics stuff. I'm putting this also on the LinkedIn page. So you're the first YouTube lecture post on LinkedIn. Yeah, we get it. Sorry, what were you saying?
Oh no, I just said I'm gonna copy the link, and I told some people that I would send it to them, and I'm gonna put it on my social media before we start. So I'm gonna do that.
Yeah, we'll probably start in about 5 minutes. Give folks time to transition on. I have it already shared on the high school page, my page. I'm gonna share it on college in a second. How are you feeling for it? Feeling good?
Yeah, I am. I'm really excited because this is it's a debate thing, but this is something I'm really passionate about, and I love talking about it, and I'm excited to watch it. Also, I read the primary source for war pornography last night, and it gave me some cool ideas that I just kind of added in.
Yes, I love that. I'm excited. I'm excited for you.
Thank you.
For folks who are watching, we'll start in about 5 minutes. We're just getting all of the tech stuff situated and ready for this lecture. Let us know that you're here in the comment section. Oh no, okay. Well, thank you, Zoom folks. I appreciate you letting us know that you're in the comment section.
Huh.
That was really important. So this is okay.
Oh my God. That's how you subvert the existential addiction to sovereignty, right there.
What happened? Or did someone comment something that I missed?
I know. Neon's got a tinfoil hat.
Oh my gosh. Is that what we were waiting for, Neon? Is this the aesthetic that we're entering the Baudrillard lecture? Okay, Baudrillard lecture, we see it. This is what we're doing.
We are. Ta-da.
Let me get the live link. Posting it on LinkedIn. We've got 2 folks watching. Hello, folks. I'm gonna give people some time and we'll get started.
Hi, Jasmine.
Hi, Jasmine.
Oh, wow. Hey. How's it going?
I'm with my friend Sylvie.
Hey.
I'm good.
Okay, so we got somebody else here. So, hey, Sylvie.
Hi, Sylvie.
Hi. Yes, Sylvie and Sylvia.
Yeah, it's very confusing.
Sylvia's always talking about you, like 24/7.
That's so nice.
We didn't say they were nice things. We just said that she talks about you.
Yeah. We're in really intense traffic right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Good times.
That does sound like it. I mean, you know.
Yeah, we're about to kill each other. It's fine.
Heard you. Don't do that.
I try not to.
For folks watching, we will be starting soon.
Yeah, just sending out the link to everyone so we can raise consciousness about the dangers of consciousness raising.
Yes. All right. LinkedIn post is posted. Swing the beat. Perfect. I've got one more place to share this, college. Ooh. Post. All right, I'm going to start doing the talking intro stuff, and then we will get started, everybody. Ooh, forgot to put on my hoodie because no, we're not doing that. We're not exposing thyself. Right. Pen. Add pen. Awesome. Welcome, welcome, welcome everybody back to another workshop lecture hosted and presented by Debate Boutique. We are always so excited to be able to have these workshop lectures available not only to our students, but to the public. We want this to become the hashtag new normal, new standard, because the wonderful intellectual work that all of our programs do, not just Debate Boutique, but for all the students in the debate community, is something that is so valuable and should be shared across institutions, because there are students for financial circumstances and or time circumstances that are not able to attend programs. And so to make sure that they have access to the information now instead of in August or September or never, I think it's important that we start sharing more of this information to boost our community and to keep the conversations of debate going, elevated, and accessible. And so with that, I only have 2 to 3 more things to say, because I do want this excellent lecture by Kate to take place. And I'm super excited for all of you all to receive that. A lot of hard work has been put into this. And so y'all are going to really leave with a lot of gems. If you've not been introduced to Baudrillard before or in Deleuze, y'all know this it's not my genre, but it's a genre that I respect the intellectual labor that goes into its explanations of the world, et cetera, et cetera. But the second thing that I want to say is that there will be new fall services launched on August 15th. This is for both private there's multiple things. Private coaching, so one-on-one coaching, but where you get access to multiple coaches at once. This is both a statement to students in high school and college and to programs at large, but also to folks who are looking to be hired as potential consultants. We are expecting, an increase in our numbers. Of course, we are keeping to a very limited set to keep with our engagement and boutique kind of experience, but our community is growing, and we want Debate Boutique to be a site of opportunity, not only for our students, but for those who get to work and engage with the kind of collaborative project that is Debate Boutique. So look forward to August 15th, because there'll also be promos and deals for the limited number of enrollment that we're opening up for our one-on-one coaching. There will also be project curriculum, which is going to be what we've been doing for the past 6 months, working with individual programs and high schools and colleges to build 2-week, 4-week, 6-week projects to help teach and mentor debate lecture series, et cetera, et cetera. And there's just so much more that is coming. So make sure that you are following us on all of our social media platforms, because that's usually where we post about this first. There will be some YouTube videos explaining each of the services that will be launched on August 15th, but we think it's important to get this to y'all into your minds now, as students are looking for private coaching and situations, but also as programs are trying to figure out niche opportunities to build their curriculum designs at their respective schools. The third thing that I want to say, and it's the thing that I always say, is that if you are watching this YouTube video live, or if you are watching the recording, you should subscribe. A lot of hard work goes into producing these, not only workshop lectures, but into the overall project of Debate Boutique. And so if you can help grow our community, its engagement, by just subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing our content. That means a great deal to us. It doesn't take too much time to hit those buttons and to engage. It's actually free. So help one of the only Black women-owned businesses in debate as we try to cultivate some kind of countercultural movement in this activity that is accessible, that is fun, that is also still competitive for our students. And the last thing, and the thing that we came here for, is the excellent lecture that's put together by Kate Marin. She is a, argument and research strategist consultant, whatever you want to call it, for Debate Boutique. And so what that means is that a lot of intellectual work in terms of research, in terms of putting together a digestible presentation for students to understand the implications and theories of Deleuze and Baudrillard are going to be hitting you hard with some facts, with some conceptual frames, and hopefully with some kind of strategic ends for how this argument kind of works in rounds so that it can be something that is exportable for you. Kate is a very successful debater and young, so there's always a lot to look forward to for the rest of her career. Goes to Binghamton University, and so this is going to be an excellent lecture, and I'm going to make you now the host, Kate, so that you can get all your share screen stuff ready to go to share with folks. And I believe that is the last thing that I have to say. I hope you all enjoy. This is going to be really, really good, and welcome to Debate Boutique. We're super excited to have you.
All right. Hi, everyone. That was an incredible introduction from Jasmine. I hope that I can live up to the hype. I need a second to get my screen shared, etc. But before I do that, if you're in the Zoom and you're watching, at any point, if you have a question, just use the hand raise feature. Please interact. I'll be asking y'all questions. I'd love to have this be more, it's hard to make it an actual dialogue, but I would love some interactions. If you are watching the live stream and you put a question in the chat there, I'll check it every time I switch. Yeah, 1 second. I see the chat. I'll check it every time I switch sections. So I will, so if there are questions there, that's when I'll hit them up. And then if the people in the Zoom would rather just type questions, I'll check the chat also there when I switch sections. Okay, let me share my screen. This is always the best part of giving a presentation, where it's okay, wait, hold on a second. I know what I need to do. I will just sit here and make kind of awkward eye contact with the camera while I set this up. Hope everyone's enjoying that. Oh, thank God. Okay, cool. Whoa, that's weird. That's not what I meant to do. It's supposed to be as a virtual background. Hold on a second. I'm gonna wait and see. It says something's loading. So maybe when it finishes loading, vamos a ver. I have no idea. 1 of 20. Merge video. Whoa, that's cool. Okay, we got it. We got it. All right. Give me 1 second. I need to just close the door in my room, and then we'll get going. Alrighty. Ooh, hello, we are all set. Okay, so Jasmine already did an incredible job of introducing me. I'm Kate Marin. I'm an argument and research specialist at Debate Boutique. I've been debating for 6 years, and I'm currently doing so at Binghamton University, where I'm studying psychology, linguistics, and Spanish. And instead of giving the whole overview that was already given, I'm just going to show everyone my shirt, which is the vibe for the lecture. It says, "Don't take life too seriously. It's not permanent." So those are kind of the energy when you get into pomo stuff like this. We'll get there, though. You know the vibes. Okay, so objectives and summary. Okay, so as it says, please do not try to copy this list. These are my keywords by section. There are a lot of them. we'll move through all of them. They'll all be covered individually, but it's kind of just to give a like kind of framework for understanding. So the purpose of this lecture is kind of twofold. So there's a lot of postmodernism in debate and like just kind of around, and it's pretty inaccessible. It's very like esoteric and like kind of ivory tower. And there's, you know, a lot of jargon, and that kind of turns people off from like looking into it. And oftentimes like the field gets kind of devalued because it's seen as something just for like academia. But the reality is it's a research specialty, just like something like chemistry or like physics, right? And these words like affect and territorialization and faciality, they all have meanings and definitions. But there's very often not enough time, particularly in debate, but just kind of in general, to explain like what the warrants are behind those things. And also like sometimes not as much of a depth of understanding that there are actually warrants behind those things, right? Like social sciences are sciences and they have explanations for stuff and definitions for words. And so the hope with this lecture is to kind of create a starting point, like a jumping off point, because like there is no way I will be able to cover all of postmodernism in like 1.5 hours. But ideally I'll be able to create the skills and kind of the resources and the setup to give you the skills to teach yourself and to understand where you need to start and kind of what the vibe is. But there's plenty of literature bases that I won't be able to cover, things like biopolitics and queer theory. We'll talk about it a little bit, but like no time for that. But this is a good kind of general overview. Okay, yeah. TLDR, the goal is not magically to turn y'all into pomo experts. It is to give you the ability to turn yourself into pomo experts. And hopefully when you're around and someone says like information is dissuasive, it will no longer be like, what is this Baudrillard nonsense? But instead, okay, well, if you're claiming information is dissuasive, here are like 3 places where your case is contradictory, you know, you kind of get the vibes. So before we get going, are there like questions, comments, concerns, existential anguish? I see in the YouTube chat, yeah, probably this is a little bit accelerationist, which is hilarious, but we'll vibe through it anyway. It's like inevitable, right? There's no actual outside to the system. Alrighty, no hands up, so we're gonna go here. I hope everybody likes the BoJack Horseman reference. Okay, so philosophy is a giant historical TV drama, basically. You start in like a very, very long time ago, and then it's just a giant dialectical process, shout out to Hegel, of people being like, wait, no, you got this thing wrong. And that just invalidates your theory. So like, what about this other thing? And then there's like call outs and, you know, like drama and pettiness. It's hilarious. It's like a bunch of like toddlers yelling at each other about like truth and metaphysics. And so it's very much like debate in that way. Like if you kind of look at argument development over time, and also like the actual interaction of a debate round, or even the process of like the dialectical process, that's much easier to say than whatever version of that word I was going for, in which like 2 ideas come into like clash with each other and create a new idea. But because like philosophy kind of works like that, it's really difficult to kind of just pick up from, you know, like Baudrillard, because he's building on all of these other theories. And this kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, in the way that like critical theory is like a academic specialization. So like a kind of good, I'm going to give one more analogy and then I promise I'll stop harping on this. To look to like, I would not expect myself to be able to like pick up a geophysics research paper and just like read it and be like, oh yeah, I got this, right? Because there's a lot going on. We're building on stuff. And similarly, we're going to have to start from the Enlightenment, unfortunately. But luckily, I won't walk you through like the classics. Can't see my air quotes. We'll just start from, you know, 1700s. So a quote, and I will say this is the only time I will read off the slide. There are a few quotes, but this is so we all have a second to like sit with it. So, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law from Immanuel Kant on the groundwork on the metaphysics of morals. Does anybody in the Zoom have like a hot take about this, like a guess as to why we're starting with it, other than Neon, who has already heard me explain why this is relevant to what we're talking about? Anyone got anything to say, throw around about Kant and the Enlightenment? No?
I have
Okay.
a guess.
Oh, go for it. Yes.
I mean, like the quote, my interpretation of it, it seems like you should act on your thought that you think should become how everyone else like views things.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the quote is very much, it's like the categorical imperative, you know, the idea that like for something to be a guiding ethical principle, it should be something that we follow in every single instance. And this kind of gets to the root of like the project of the Enlightenment. Everyone was like getting really excited about creating universal laws for things. And so you can see it in like physics and chemistry and biology. People are starting to realize that like, you know, like there are systems kind of that work in particular ways, and we can understand how those things work with science. And so philosophy kind of looks at this and is like, yo, wait, what if like we could do that with like ideas, you know, concepts? And this presents kind of a problem because we're still in the 1700s in Europe, in like Western Europe. And the problem here is twofold. The first problem is we have a group of like straight, white, upper middle class privileged men from Western Europe sitting down together to decide the universal laws to define reality, which is where we get a lot of the problems that we have today in terms of how ideology operates, i.e. Things like humanism were developed in this era. And so that is the group of people that sat down and like theorized about what it meant to be like an ideal human subject. So you can kind of see why that might have been a problem. And actually, if you look up Kant on Wikipedia, his racism and like biological essentialism section is almost as long as his metaphysics section, which is absurd because he's remembered as a metaphysician. The second problem with this is that we're still in the 1700s. So the Enlightenment's really excited about the idea of individual rationality, that people can understand things themselves. But the church and the monarchy still have the power to like exile people and like execute them. And those are like really big structuring powers that do not want a population that is like super excited about self-determination. And so that definitely puts limits on like how hard you can go with like individual rationality, which absolutely implicated some people's theories. But anyway, the purpose of starting with Kant is that he attempts to develop a universal law of ethics that can be like applied equally and in the same way in every single instance ever. And the like kind of example that people usually give of this is he says that it is immoral or evil to tell a lie. So on like face, it kind of sounds like it could be okay because it's like, okay, maybe we should have some like universal guiding principles that like people just follow to be like good to each other. But then you kind of come face first into this issue with like the reality of the complete chaos that is existence. So for instance, the answering example that's often given is, okay, so what if it is World War II and a Nazi is knocking on your door asking if there are any Jews in your house? To not give them up if they are there would be a lie. And if it is unethical to lie, then you cannot protect those people. And you can basically do this with any universal principle of ethics. Like, we shouldn't kill people. Well, what if, well, now we've got the trolley problem. What if killing one person will prevent a lot more people from being killed? You know, if you had the opportunity to kill Hitler before the Holocaust, so on and so forth. And it's like none of these questions can really have, well, yeah, I'm gonna full send that. None of these questions can really have definitive answers. I might have a very strong belief about one thing or another, but like there is not really something that says like this is what ethics is. This is what it means to be a good person. And so that becomes the problem with the Enlightenment. And we'll get there in our next section, but first I want to do a quick little like framing thing. These are words you will be glad later that we talked about now. I do want to give a quick disclaimer. This is just my organization of these concepts, and like I've had several arguments with various like friends and like academic like associates. That's not the word I'm looking for. Acquaintances. That's what I was looking for. About where I put various things. I know some people who think that semiotics should be a lot higher than it is. This is just what makes sense to me. So we'll start with materiality. And we're actually, in an homage to my demo debate, going to do this with a can of Red Bull. So the material reality of this Red Bull is like, I'm holding it in my hand, right? Like I have a physical can of Red Bull. I have something that I can theoretically spill all over my desk in the middle of a demo debate if I am so directed. And kind of moving through that, so we've got this next layer, it's epistemology and semiotics. What do we like perceive at like the level of information about the idea of kind of a Red Bull? sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's like, okay, I see this and it's like, well, Red Bull gives you wings. This is kind of the idea for me of like a very tired college student, the kind who is clumsy and tends to knock over cans that are still full of liquid. And so like that is filtered through kind of the things that I perceive about like the information that I received. Like, this is an energy drink. Energy drinks are for certain like demographics. Who are they marketing to? What does that marketing look like? What kind of brand image are they proposing? And that would be that layer. Ontology, epistemology at like a definitional level is the study of knowledge production and knowledge perception. Semiotics is the study of like kind of information and language and the way that those things are structurally implicated by things like capitalism and power structures. So ontology, coming above epistemology and semiotics, is the study of knowing. So we can learn things and then they exist in our head in this like abstract image. So whereas I might have a Red Bull or learn information about a Red Bull, if there is no Red Bull, what do I imagine when I'm like confronted with that idea? What is your mental understanding? And kind of within that, it depends who you ask. Some theorists will say we have like a collective social understanding of a Red Bull, that we all have like some kind of baseline of perception of what that means. Whereas like other theorists will say, you know, it's like very much kind of like nature versus nurture. Like, it's what we've learned. It's the environment and like the things that we have integrated into our understanding via epistemology and semiotics. And so when I imagine a Red Bull, like, do you just imagine the can? Do you imagine somebody drinking it? Do you imagine an advertisement? Those things are your ontological perceptions. So this is where I get the most like clash from people who disagree with me. My next layer is metaphysics, subjecthood, consciousness, and perception. So we will eventually talk about each of these things, but metaphysics are values. So like, is Red Bull good or bad? What kind of people drink Red Bull? Are they good or bad? In my mind, they are tired. What does that mean for that person, i.e. subjecthood? What kind of decisions would lead you here? What kind of values would you have that would allow you to drink this? So like, I am valuing not being exhausted over the health of my internal organs as I drink this, which would implicate what kind of like subject I am, what kind of values I hold, and what I perceive to be important, what I perceive about reality. So the highest layer of this is affect and difference, and we're gonna have a whole conversation about what that means. But basically, like, we're talking about like the atomic physical existence of the fact that this can is here and that the can and my hand are two different things. And keep that in your head, because that will come back, that I am holding the can in my hand. The can is not my hand. We'll get there with Baudrillard. So anyway, that was kind of a lot. Are there questions, comments, concerns, existential anguish about anything that we've covered so far? Alrighty, good vibes. So, looks like there are no questions in the chat. These are my section switches, so I checked. Okay, so like we said, there's a kind of historical timeline, and at least in my humble opinion, I think it is pretty impossible to talk about Deleuze and Baudrillard without talking about Nietzsche. So in my lecture title, The Death of God was in reference to Friedrich Nietzsche. So we're gonna spend some time talking about the foundations of existentialism. So we've got these keywords here, good vibes. The other important thing is Nietzsche is writing in response to the Enlightenment era principles that we talked about. So this is like the kind of TV show type answer, you know, when you've got two people who are feuding and arguing over who's right, and like it's very melodramatic in my professional opinion. He's answering Kant. And so we will start with kind of a conversation about values, ethics, and metaphysics. So I'm gonna stop speaking at you for a moment and open up a question again. Does anybody have a hot take about what these kinds of things mean, or why they might be relevant to what we are talking about with Nietzsche? Anyone? Again, it's okay, because we're in a lecture, so we're learning. Okay, I guess in the future, if I ask a question, do the hand raise thing, so that we don't have to like do this super fun waiting period where I ramble about stuff. But for now, I'm going to explain. So I'm going to start with metaphysics, which is kind of like the structuring piece that values and ethics will fall under. So metaphysics is kind of the internal system of valuation or of like decision making that relies on what we think is important and what we think a good decision is and what we think a good person would do or should do. And so people have kind of in their head a metaphysical set, and that metaphysical set is composed of values. So this is something we come into contact with and debate quite a bit. It's the like framing debate, right? A utilitarian frame would say, you know, the most important thing is, maybe if you're reading Bostrom, is like preserving the most lives. And so life would be something that is good, or like an intrinsic good. So that would be a value. We talked earlier in that like triangle slide about the idea of the values that allow me to decide to drink a Red Bull. I value my like awakeness over my potential internal organ damage from chemicals in the drink. This is kind of an essential question in terms of like, or wait, no, I just said that. I'm not gonna make you say, or make everybody listen to me say it again. So your set of values and your internal metaphysical set is what comprises ethics. And so this is why Nietzsche is kind of critiquing the Enlightenment, because the project of like people like Kant was to create a set of values to comprise a universal ethics. The idea that we should all hold the same things within our metaphysical set that will decide what kind of choices that we make. That's kind of tough because like we don't all value the same things. Like it really just comes down to that. Like different cultures have different values, different people have different values. Values are filtered through things like the media we consume and the way that we're raised and just like the preferences we have and the kind of people that we are. And so trying to define something for everyone is really difficult, particularly in relation to well, we'll get into this in a couple slides, but like the question of God. So the next piece of this is how do these kinds of things function today? Because Nietzsche has been dead for like a hot minute, definitely since the 1800s. So are we still working with his ideas? Well, I think so. Plenty of other people do too. And the kind of current instantiation of things like value, ethics, metaphysics, but updated to how we're interacting with them now, starts with what's called the existential addiction to sovereignty. So this relies on an idea that actually I will go to the next slide. Oh, that's not in the box, but you know, whatevs. I guess it's a little deterritorialized for your viewing pleasure. So kind of the most common quote that I hear and the kind of least the least correct interpretation, like people like to throw around, God is dead. You know, God is dead and we have killed him. He's just some edgelord who just wanted to say whack things for attention. But there's a lot of kind of important pieces of the argument that's being made when addressing the question of Nietzsche and God and ethics. So if we look back at the Enlightenment project, Kant was important because he was the first thinker to try to develop a universal system of ethics that did not rely on religion for its foundation. And that was tough. And Kant did not do that successfully. And in fact, nobody did that successfully. So Nietzsche is now coming in looking at religion and saying, well, this is kind of a problem because there is no universal set of values. There is no universal metaphysical set. So why are people pretending that there is? I'm sorry, it's raining and my window's open. I have to fix that. Window is closed. I have my Nietzsche mug, which I feel like is an important prop to have here. And I'm coming back to talking about the death of God. So what is God in a world where there is no universal ethics, where there is no absolute truth, where there is no universal perception of reality, no universal interaction with the world? Well, Nietzsche considers these things a mechanism of control, that if you tell the population what makes a good person, what is a correct value set, that decides what kinds of decisions they make. And so we can see this when we come back to what I was saying was the existential addiction to sovereignty. A sovereign power has the ability to do things like control the media, to, or maybe not control, but like heavily dictate what's allowed within the media, to run public education, to decide what kinds of information are allowed to be disseminated, what kind of validity that information gets. Like these large power structures have a lot of control over what we perceive and what we interact with. And those things can be used to enforce values. What is a good citizen? What makes a good citizen a good person? What kinds of decisions does a good citizen make? You know, do we call the police when there's a problem? Do we stop at stop signs even when there are no police officers there? Do we pay our taxes and support the war machine, right? And if they can make sure that the answer to those questions is yes, that we are following the metaphysical set that has been given to us by a power structure, then we will make decisions that are always in line with power, with the sovereign. And then they don't need like policing and hard power to control us, because we will police ourselves, we will police other people, and we will live our lives on behalf of kind of the will of power. And so the existential addiction to sovereignty is the idea that it is very easy and it is much more comfortable to continue to be a cog in the machine, to just like kind of sit and listen to what has been said and presented and follow the path that you're supposed to, and you know, be the good citizen, and be the good person as defined for you. And so Nietzsche says that we killed God in the sense that we attempted to become God. We decided that we were the arbiters of what a like kind of universal system of ethics could be, and like how people should behave. And in that way, the idea of religion is something that could potentially be like meaningful and freeing and individual and liberating disappeared. And a lot of current authors that are writing about this kind of stuff look at like are arguing that we like God has come back and we need to kill God again. That this existential addiction to sovereignty, it might not be based in like the church or in religion nearly as much, but that other power structures do the same thing, because it's a very, very, very effective way to keep a population in check. And the population might have numbers, but if they're not using them, then it's not an issue. Okay, I am not actually going to read off the slide for this one. This is a long quote, and we just talked about it. So the next piece of this is the death of God becomes a crisis for power. Because if you look back at like when Nietzsche is writing, the kind of shift away from like intense religious kind of cultural vibes, that might not be the most eloquent way to put that, but you know what I mean. Suddenly the question for like the elite and like the monarchy who are ruling via divine right is like, how are we going to maintain the system of control? And so they create new structures to create values. Things like philosophy, things like Enlightenment era philosophy exist to continue to enforce those kinds of norms and standards. And you know, it never kind of stops. And that's why theoretically, if you buy into all this, we need to kill God again, not by attempting to become him, but by refusing to follow what has been laid out. The last important thing, and that'll go to here, is in a world without God, in a world where there is no like omnipotent being that has designed reality, there is no grand meaning, there is no grand plan. We do not have a designed, predestined purpose. We're just here. There's no truth. There's only our perception of truth. There is no like exact way to be a good person. There's no set of values that we can follow and then, you know, like prove ourselves to be good ethical subjects and become godly and go to heaven. Like that is not what Nietzsche is describing as the way that like life and reality are structured. And that's terrifying for a lot of people. And that is another really common misreading of Nietzsche, that we should see that and be nihilists. We'll talk a little bit more, actually, we will talk right now about the vibes with that. Wow, I did a really good job keeping my words in the boxes on the slides here. Ooh. Okay, so before we get into the different kinds of nihilism and how everyone ever basically is misreading Nietzsche, I want to talk about a concept that's pretty related to this, which is the idea of the real and the apparent world. So we are faced with an imperfect reality, right? And that is especially relevant in relation to a reality with no grand plan or universal meaning or metric for good and evil. And so we suffer. And the fact that suffering is meaningless is terrifying. And so firstly, this is one of the ways that Nietzsche explains why religion is so enticing, particularly in like medieval Europe, because like being a peasant kind of was not ideal. And life sucked a lot of the time, and people needed to feel like there was a reason for it. And so people were very attracted to the idea that there was a grand plan and a religion to follow that would explain, you know, like it might be awful to exist, but there's like value in suffering, right? And like we should embrace that. And so this misreading is, Nietzsche is not saying suffering is good. That's not what agonism means at all. That's actually what he's critiquing. He's saying that we live in a world where those things happen, where bad things happen, and we have material problems all the time. And that's inevitable. But you'll notice it's actually very uncharacteristic to describe Nietzsche, for Nietzsche to describe something as good, because he is the original creator of being is beyond good and evil. And if you look at all of the things that I have said so far, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because like the act of something physically existing, like got this can here, we're just gonna keep looping back to it. Like this Red Bull is not intrinsically like a good or bad thing. It means something different to everybody. The like kind of ethical standpoint of the object can only come from your relationship to it. So an example that's given a lot of times is poison. If I have like a thing of poison, that is not intrinsically good or bad, it just exists. What do I do with it? What is it used for? What is my personal relationship to it? Those things will decide my subjective moral understanding of that, but that relationship is not static. It's not the same for everybody. And so how can the poison be intrinsically good or bad? I mean, it kind of can't unless you've decided that your relationship to it is more important than everybody else's. And that's a little bit Deleuzian, so we'll probably loop back. So when faced with, so I got on a little bit of a tangent. So when we're faced with this world filled with meaningless, awful suffering, and that being the apparent world, suffering and contingency is contained within the apparent world, we imagine an escape. We imagine a world where there is no suffering, where we've fixed whatever our problem is, where we've kind of created a world where we can live potentially like freely or without some form of oppression or without something that we face that is like a challenge. And so that imagined world is what he calls the real. And that world is a utopia. It's perfect. We fixed something. The problem arises when this world is figured as the real, as opposed to what it is, which is an ideal utopia, something we might aim for, because we come to define the apparent world in its differences from and its proximity to the real or the imagined world. And so we become disconnected from the materiality of like our lives, of what we are living in, of what we are experiencing, because our entire project as a person becomes defined by this desperate need to achieve this utopia that never existed and probably never will. And that's also important because if there's no grand plan and everything is an atomistic chaos, then like we can try as hard as we want, but there are always factors outside of our control that will always implicate whether or not we can get to our like little utopias. And the kind of trick of power, or the cruel, like kind of hidden piece of this, is that because of like this internal subjectivized nature, it becomes personal. It's like it's our fault that we couldn't fix this problem, that somehow we are insufficient as people because we weren't able to solve our suffering or solve the suffering of somebody else. And so that is where you get ressentiment. Can't like point, the pointing is not working super well, but you know what I mean. We get ressentiment, which is kind of two things. The first is an understanding of life in which we have like termed the apparent world entirely in relation to the imperfections that would be solved if we could reach the real. And second, that we have internalized the inability to achieve those things and we blame ourselves. And so you often see this as like an impact magnifier in a round, because it's like, if we're not going to fix the thing, but we're going to pretend we fixed it with like fiat. So like the 1AC, fiat something and we fix it, but it doesn't actually get fixed, right? The problem still exists. And now it kind of just feels like damn, why didn't this actually get fixed? Like, how are we going to do this? You know, like, could we fix it? Like, it's really nice to imagine, but now it just kind of feels worse that we didn't do it. So the last thing about suffering before I move on is I just want to clear up some misconceptions that are very common about agonism. So we've got this whole structure. We've got the real and the apparent world and the individual trying to figure out what they should do in a world where there's no meaning, right? And that individual is suffering because suffering is inevitable. And Nietzsche's kind of point with agonism is that instead of trying to like escape internally into this real that is not connected to reality, which is paradoxical, we need to like face those things that create suffering and learn from them and experience them and feel them and not like ignore them or like hide them away, because we continue to carry them, right? We continue to suffer. And so if we never allow ourselves to really like face those things and either resolve them or accept them or come to terms with them, we have to carry them instead of letting them walk with us. And that just makes the whole process of suffering harder. And so agonism is allowing the individual to grow as a person, to kind of come to terms with the inevitability of reality, and the inevitability of potential violence and suffering, and our either ability or inability to change those things. So Nietzsche's not saying suffering good. Nietzsche's not saying anything good. Being is beyond good and evil. If you take nothing else from this slide, that's the TLDR. All right, we are now going to the next slide. Will to power. This is another one where people have a lot of hot takes about what Nietzsche is saying, and they are mostly wrong. Also, I love this screenshot because that is actually what comes up on Google if you Google that. And I think that's incredible and also very on brand. But anyway, so we've got all the things that I've said so far about like what it means to have value and meaning, etc. Can we have those things? And certainly if we accept that there is no objective standpoint or metric or whatever to create those things, it becomes difficult to kind of situate the self. Like, what do I do now? There is no objective universal meaning. So how do we maintain value and joy when we are not like prescribed as to whether or not we'll have them? Well, this is the difference between active and passive nihilism. Passive nihilism is the idea that we face these things, this reality, and it's like, well, guess I'll just die then. I don't know what you want me to do. Like, now what? And then you just kind of sit and you're sad and you suffer and you vibe with your existential addiction to sovereignty, and you like be a cog in the machine and you live a life that is relatively joyless, and that's sucky and bad. And so this is what the will to power is, which is the ability to like look this reality, this uncaring reality in the face and go, okay, if there are no rules, if there are no purposes, I get to decide my own. What is valuable to me? What is important? What do I want to do? What kind of impact do I want to have? If I could design myself a future, what kinds of values would determine that? What kind of actions would I take? What kind of person do I want to be? And that's really empowering. And so the will to power is doing that and moving forward. And so a process of active nihilism is the recognition that there is no grand master plan, that we have no control over like all of these external forces, over the atomistic chaos of reality, which I keep saying, I just found the phrase and I think it's a good description. And so we just need to vibe through it. Like, it is what it is. Really, really, it is what it is. We are dealt a hand, and you need to find what's important to you and do the best that you can, and understand that you cannot invest in the outcomes of your actions in the same way that you can invest in their intentions. And you can be excited, and you should be excited when things work out, but we need to understand that as we're like following our paths and trying to do the things we want to do and the things that we love, sometimes things go wrong, and that's not our fault. And to believe that it would be is resentment. And this is I think this is a very powerful thing, particularly right now in like history and politics. But the kind of other piece of this is Nietzsche will say that amorality, i.e. like the lack of following a defined morality, is the condition of joy, is the ability to find value and meaning in your life is kind of a prerequisite to being able to feel joy. And I can tell you, like, in my experience, I have been a lot happier living my own values than trying to follow somebody else's. So food for thought. If you're following somebody else's vibes, maybe you could stop. Maybe you could find other vibes to follow, perhaps even your own, ideally your own. Alrighty, we are now on section 3, so it's time for a question type check-in. Okay, so I've got a comment in the chat. So I think this is an interesting take. It says that life is not vanity for everyone. Not everyone is suffering. One can be happy in hell and sad in heaven. That is true. And I don't think that's merely as much in opposition to what Nietzsche is saying as it might be like considered. Because it's not that everyone is constantly suffering all the time, or that like life is only a process of suffering, right? Like I just explained this whole way of generating like value and joy out of like out of reality. Oh, yes, I see the other question. I'll grab that in 1 second. It is that like the existence of suffering in reality is inevitable. And that might not even be at a personal level. It might just be like other people are suffering, but there is no like existence on this plane without some kind of suffering. The other piece of this is that suffering is not intrinsically sadness. It's just to suffer. And a lot of like agonists will say that you can't really find joy or happiness until you've suffered, because that process for a lot of people is really central to discovering the self. And that is, I think, why a lot of people misread Nietzsche as suffering good as opposed to suffering inevitable. But what he's saying is like, it is possible to find value in those things, and that we should seek to find value in things that don't intrinsically have it, because nothing has an intrinsic kind of value. But you can be happy in any situation, but you shouldn't have to be, you know? You should simply be aware of the fact that that's always an option. And then to answer the question in this chat, so passive nihilism is looking all of the various things that I have said about the atomistic chaos of reality in the face and going, well, damn, nothing matters. I guess I just shouldn't do anything, and I'll just be kind of sad and unhappy all the time and not vibe and be a cog in the machine, live through the existential addiction to sovereignty and kind of just vibe, but not a happy vibe, because that would be active nihilism. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns, existential anguish, which I think will grow in hilarity and relevance as I move through this, the existential anguish piece? Okay, cool. We are now in section 3, sort of. Well, yeah, no, this is, did I misnumber this? We've got 0 was background, 1 was Nietzsche, 2 should be Deleuze. I did misnumber this. That's hilarious. But anyway, we are now going to talk about Deleuze and Guattari. So D&G are following afterwards, after Nietzsche has already kind of published, after Marx, kind of, I want to say 1970s, 60s, 70s-ish, definitely 1900s. And there are a few kinds of important philosophical things that they're doing that we'll get to, but one of their projects is pulling Nietzsche out of like the 1800s and kind of rehabilitating him. And they do this with the Nietzsche on Philosophy, which was kind of the first moment after Nietzsche's sister stole his work and gave it to the Nazis, which was unfortunate and really awful, that Nietzsche was kind of really taken seriously in a critical literary canon. So that was really important, because you'll see as we go through this that a lot of the ideas that I talked about with Nietzsche are very, very present in Deleuze. The other thing, and one of my favorite critical theory fun facts, is so Deleuze and Guattari decide to rehabilitate Lacan and psychoanalysis, and that's anti-Oedipus. It is a critique of those things, but it is kind of the idea that we can look at those principles that Lacan has presented, and we can understand the problems with them, and we can use those principles in different ways that are kind of fixed or updated, or maybe there are some principles we need to get rid of. But the reason that I find this so hilarious is Lacan was still alive and actively working, and they released this book very much like very intentionally as like oh yeah, we're gonna rehabilitate Lacan, and Lacan's over here like, what do you mean? Like, I'm still writing. I'm still theorizing. What are we rehabilitating? So I think that's hilarious, and also plays back into my explanation of philosophy as a historical TV drama. But anyway, the other kind of major project is to start pulling this like very ivory tower like ethics and postmodernism into material resistance strategies and analyses of politics. So we are going to move on forward, and we are back to our lovely value pyramid. this feels weird because my image is like reflected, and so I'm gesturing in the wrong direction in real life, which when we get to Baudrillard, I'll probably have something to say about simulation, but here it just feels weird. So anyway, we're now going to talk about affect and difference. I know we said we would get back to that. So I want everyone to look at this picture of a pool table, so everyone can be reminded what it looks like, and internally envision a giant pool table, the universe itself contained as a pool table. It is infinite, it expands, it has an infinite number of pool balls, and sorry, there's a comment in the YouTube chat, Lacan, stop telling people I'm dead. That's hilarious. But anyways, we've got this pool table. So take a second, close your eyes, visualize. There are no people. There are just pool balls moving around. We'll call it frictionless for the sake of the thought experiment. They're knocking into each other and they're moving and, you know, following lines of like physics. And like we'll give Newton's laws the ability to determine how that works here. And so that process of like objects, or like it could be anything. I mean, the pool ball is just a piece of the thought experiment, like moving and running into each other and reacting and having relations and changing direction and, you know, following forces and gravity. That's affect. And that's something that's very hard to define. And it is important that like Deleuze and Guattari are defining affect differently than a lot of theorists. A lot of theorists will talk about like subject-based affect, something like emotion, but they are talking about like the capacity to have relation, the movement of the universe. And so if we take our pool table and we shrink it down and we have a group of people playing pool, let's say one of those people picks up a pool ball and throws it at somebody else. That person could react in an infinite number of ways. We have no idea. We might have a good guess, but we don't know what they're going to do for sure. So according to D&G, the capacity to react to external stimuli or the things you perceive via your own choice is consciousness. And so that kind of gives another layer of like nuance to the critique that Nietzsche is making, right? Because we make our decisions via our metaphysical set, via our values. And if the condition of making decisions, of making choices, is the condition of consciousness, then if we have given up our metaphysical set or our individual ability to determine our values, if we're following someone else's, then we have given up the ability of the subject to be conscious. And that's not great, because if we're looking at things like microfascism, right, like internalized policing, we have ceded our internal subject formation, our internal consciousness to the government, to the military, to the police, to other like large structures and institutions. And that's kind of scary, honestly. That's probably not a great world to live in, to allow everything we do and see and perceive and understand to be completely determined by structures of power. Next piece, last piece, part of this is difference, and that is the capacity of things to physically exist as different from each other. So like the idea that the two pool balls that hit each other are not the same pool ball, but that they are there and they are hitting each other, that I have a can in my hand and it is not my hand, but it is there and I am interacting with it. While I am switching the slide, I'll give you one more example. This was my example in my like kind of AF argument last year, which has to do with rocks. So we look at rocks and we see them as static and kind of just like part of the scenery, you know, they don't change. But at an atomic level, the electrons in a rock are always moving. And on a time scale much larger than one that we would normally kind of work with, they're changing and shifting and, you know, interacting with various parts of the environment. And in that way, like even those things that we consider to be, wow. I don't know if other people heard the thunder there. It is raining really hard here. But anyway, back to it. Those things that we consider to be unchanging and static and things that do not contain kind of like vibrance and life are just as much in motion and flux and relation as everything else, which I think is a really like important way to understand kind of what it means to be a subject, what it means to be conscious that does not rely on humanism. So here we are with Lacan and psychoanalysis. So we're going to do a really quick TLDR because the critique that Deleuze and Guattari are making requires some kind of background. In the same way that understanding Nietzsche required a little bit on Kant, Deleuze and Guattari are talking about psychoanalysis, so we'll chat about it for a second. So there are a couple of key things to understand here. The first is the mirror stage. And I'm sorry, you'll notice I'm skipping Freud. I'm skipping Freud because Freud is it's just not valid. And Lacan took all of the pieces of Freud that may be considered valid and made them substantially more valid, in my professional opinion. So if you want to read Freud, go do it. But Lacan kind of rescued as much as he could and moved on with his life and talked about other things. So that's where we're going to focus. So Lacan talks about the mirror stage. And the idea of the mirror stage is that you've got like what is literally an infant that has no conceptualization of the world, of the self, of anything, like no object permanence. And this infant eventually, at some point, looks into a mirror and sees itself or themselves. And at some point recognizes that they are reflected in the mirror. And when the infant sees themselves reflected in the mirror, they realize that they are a subject and that they are externally perceptible to other people, that other people have an idea of them that is not what exists in their own head. And so at that point, the subject kind of splits because you have an internal perception and the understanding of an external subject that you are also kind of representative of. And that moment establishes the ability to kind of have relationality and sociality. And that is the subject's entrance into language, because you can't communicate with others until you recognize the self as the like messenger and the other as the receiver. And so that entrance into language is like irreversible. And at that moment, we come to understand reality in terms of linguistics, in terms of what we have the capacity to describe with words. And that we will get to a lot more with Baudrillard. But the point of the mirror stage, language semiotics. Again, we'll get here later, but representations fail to contain reality, i.e. like a linguistic description of something will never be perfect, and there will always be something missing. You will never return to that original state where the subject was whole, or the original state of wholeness. And so that loss creates lack. You are lacking the entirety of your own subjecthood. You are lacking a direct relationship to reality that isn't mediated by language. And Lacan says that that is how desire works, is we desire to fill the lack. The other important thing is that because we started with Freud, psychoanalysis is a psychological process, i.e. like psychologists and therapists. And so one of the other kind of important things to this theory is that we can use it to fix subjects, to fix what Freud would call neuroses, which are just like inconsistencies with like what the social norms regarding like behavior and belief are, which is kind of problematic, and we'll talk about Deleuze and Guattari. Oh my god. Again, don't know if y'all can hear the thunder, but the thunder is quite a bit. Anyway, y'all can still hear me, right? Like anyone, somebody in the Zoom, someone in the chat. The thunder is really.
We can hear you.
Okay, cool, thank you. Awesome, so we're gonna talk about microfascism. I think, yeah. Okay, so we've got these like psychoanalytic principles, right? Like the subject should behave in a certain way, and there's this like universal structure to understand that. And the process of psychoanalysis seeks to like contain the subject within that. And that is the will to order. That is the ordering principle, that there is a set of norms and like ways that we should be, i.e. like in ethical system, and that people and things and ideas and concepts all need to fall into that. The problem is, if there is an order, then someone has to establish the order and hold other people within it. And the people who have the power to establish that order are the people with their hands on the levers of power. And so the order is never going to be established neutrally. Instead, it's going to be established for those who have the power to enforce it. And this process will be weaponized against those who do not fit. So oftentimes, like Black folks and queer folks and disabled folks, like are kind of there's an attempt to moderate or mediate within the will to order. And what this also does is presents a false choice that you can conform or you can be killed. And it's like, that's not really a choice. It's definitely, it's not a choice. But they have the ability now to go back and say, look, you had another option. You didn't have to assimilate. You didn't have to give up, your identity. You could have just died. And it's never presented quite that directly. But another example of this within like psychoanalysis is in the kind of idea of the schizophrenic. And so we're going to come back to this slide, but I'm now disagreeing with my previous move to order these slides, which I guess very in line with D&G and the world order being bad. But anyway, so a schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic lying on the analyst's couch, a breath of fresh air, a relationship with the outside world. So it is the idea that if we follow other people's understandings of what the subject should be, what the subject should do, we all just become a model of power, and we don't live our own values. We don't live our own lives. We're back at Nietzsche, right, with the idea of active nihilism and agency. And so like as much as the psychoanalyst's role is to fix neuroses, the like sovereign's role is to create like epistemic and metaphysical conformity to fix the people who do not rely on the norms. And I'm just going to give everyone a heads up. I don't think my power is going to go out, but the lights just flashed twice. So if I disappear, that's why. But anyway, so all these things are kind of problematic, but the way that we fix neuroses, again in air quotes, and first to be viewed as a neurosis, to be viewed as a problem, already requires some kind of ordering principle. And so we fix these things by kind of like shoehorning them into the norm and punishing what doesn't fit. So we're going to go back and talk about faciality. So faciality being the idea that there is an abstract or an ontological image of what the ideal subject is, that there is a face for humanity. And so then we are able to define, or maybe not we, but the ruling power is able to define the value of an individual, the like kind of importance or like human capacity or social capacity in proximity or like by degrees of difference from the face. And so this is D&G's kind of explanation of how violence operates, is that we are presented with like the ideal image of like of man. And it's that Enlightenment image again. You've got the like straight white upper middle class, like relatively privileged, like Christian man that is like well educated and so on and so forth. I could list characteristics for a while, but that face sits at the top of the hierarchy, and then underneath that we have someone who doesn't meet one or two characteristics, and underneath that and so on and so forth, you have an array of individuals, and how far you are from the face is how far you are from being human, in being citizen, being valued, being socially alive. And the last thing we'll see here on this slide is homo-nationalism, which is Poir's theory, and it is that we can, like institutions can take bits and pieces and like kind of reorder them and integrate them in terms of the proximity to the face. So the example that's given is that the military will now let in like queer soldiers, and that's kind of shifted. I'm not actually sure where the laws are with that at this particular moment. I know the last administration versus this one, but in any case, at some point the military decided that was okay, but it was under don't ask, don't tell. We're still not going to acknowledge it. We're still not going to value it. We won't call queerness equal, but we'll let you in, so that you can be integrated, so you can be assimilated, so you can be part of part of the military industrial complex, part of the war machine. And now the state has the ability to virtue signal, to look at other nations that are less like allowing and be like, wow, y'all won't like let your like y'all are so like anti-queer, we're so great, like look, we'll even let them in the military as long as they don't tell us that they're queer. And that also allows like other violent actions like the US military in general, things like imperialism in the military industrial complex, to hide behind this perception of progressivity and liberalism. The last piece is like this requires a process of integration. So like it is very much don't ask, don't tell. Do not behave visibly as though you are queer. Simply exist here, allow us to profit off of the idea that you are probably here somewhere, but no one should ever know. We don't want to actually have that like integration. We just want it to seem like we did, so we can profit off of it. Like you can just be glad that you chose the assimilation option instead of the genocide option. So it's not nearly as like beneficial as it is postured to be. So wow, as I'm seeing these slides, I'm just seeing all the spots where the words are not where I thought they were when I finished the PowerPoint. And I think it's probably because I downloaded it to Word so that I could use it as a background. But I do think it's really funny and kind of on brand that everything moved before I actually presented it. Like, why is the S not attached to schizoanalysis? Who knows? But anyway, so Deleuze and Guattari's answer to this whole kind of psychoanalytic understanding of subject and world is to not contain the subject, to not be territorialized, territorialization being the confining factor where things are reduced into those categories that are a part of the will to order. And that instead we should follow lines of flight. So lines of flight are kind of a phrase that goes in opposition to Kantian lines. And those Kantian lines are the ordering principles. That is what allows the will to order to exist. So instead, we should follow lines of flight, which are, there is no start, there is no end, there is no prescription or path, they cannot be mapped. They are when you you connect to your own affect or your own agency, your own will to power, and you follow it ever further towards the exterior forces and flows kind of vibes. And so this is also kind of related to assemblage building, which is the understanding of the subject as relational. There is not one static subject, even not even in an ideal sense, but in a material sense. We are constantly in flux and in relation. Our body is not one thing, it is a bunch of parts and pieces, or for D&G, machines that are working together and interacting with other machines, either parts of ourselves or parts of others or parts of materiality. And this is also kind of in relation to that concept that we run into with it's in the Camp Ath, and it's in a lot of Sec-Hall arguments and Anthro arguments. The idea that we can be separate from our environment doesn't make sense if the kind of structuring principle of existence is affect, because that's something that is in everything. Okay, Desire and Schizoanalysis. The next part of D&G, the other part of their critique, they're critiquing psychoanalysis and they're critiquing Marxism. And I'm not going to blame Marx for this, because he died before the internet happened, and how could he have known? But there are some major differences between a structural Marxist understanding of capital and a semiotic or post-structuralist understanding. So the first is the difference between production and consumption economics. So a consumption economic structure focuses on material capital, on the means of production, on who owns the factories and who owns the land, who is profiting off of labor alienation and exploitation. It is very material. It is very much about, as I've said a few times now, production. A semiotic understanding of this is a lot more focused on consumption, on the sign economy, on virtualization and information. And the reason for this is as we've moved into post-structural or late stage capitalism, we're not marketing products anymore. We are not focused on labor. We're focused on ideas, on information. You're not selling, a Red Bull, you're selling an idea, a brand. Red Bull gives you wings. And we think about that. And so I might buy the product, but I'm not really buying the product. I'm buying what has been marketed to me, what has been sold to me. And so as opposed to a focus on physical production, we are looking at the production of consumers, the act of manufacturing people to consume your products. Yes, this always makes me think of that Bo Burnham bit where he's it's not about whether or not you want wheat thins. It's do you support wheat thins in the fight against Lyme disease? And it's that is what the information exchange is. That is the virtualized kind of economic system. The other major difference between these two things is how they view how we got here. So Marx is building off of Hegel, which is very, very structuralist. There is a linear reading of history that follows the idea that there is a thesis, so some kind of idea, and an antithesis, so an opposing idea, and they come into conflict and you create a synthesis and you have something else, and that synthesis becomes the new thesis. And there is a start point to capitalism and there's an end point, and we are inevitably moving from one to the other. That is structuralism. And Marx would take Hegel's idea of dialectical processes and just describe it in terms of class conflict. So on the other hand, we've got postmodernism, post-structuralism, which looks at these things and is yeah, I mean, we should definitely acknowledge that history exists, but existed, whatever. Also, who's writing it? It's mediated by perception. Can we understand it linearly? Do we all have the same understanding of time? Probably not. Does it make sense to isolate like a starting point and an ending point or an objective set of factors that is deterministic of these things? Probably not. And so as opposed to describing like kind of the historical process that got us here in depth to assume that it will continue to happen that same way, it's more about kind of analyzing and integrating the relational factors that implicate what the vibes are at any particular moment and where those vibes originated and how they were described and how that might implicate them. All right, so they've got an answer. The thing that you can't see because all of my text moved says rhizomes, but Deleuze and Guattari are kind of, well, I don't want to say unique, but they are unique in the context of Baudrillard, as they present kind of a specific material set of like ideas and actions you can take to fix things. Anyway, where did it go? So basically they describe like a strategy for resistance and for movements, that those things should be unintelligible. They should not be organized along a central structuring authority or hierarchy, which is another distinction from kind of classic descriptions of things like Marxism, where you would have like potentially the vanguard or like the dictatorship of the proletariat. But Deleuze and Guattari argue that that is what allows co-option to happen. Like that's why we see like failures when we end up with things like Stalinism, where it's like that person doesn't step down, you end up with a hierarchy. And when it comes down to it, D&G are really critiquing hierarchy. And so instead, to resist co-option and to create something that is like not kind of immediately like visible and kind of crushable by the state. I don't know if crushable is really used in that context, but we'll roll with it. You should have something that is decentralized, that is not predictable, that is rhizomatic, that is relational, that kind of is random and it's hard to track, because the state can plan if they know what they're planning for, but if you're not operating along kind of like traditional and static notions of like resistance and warfare, they're always stuck reacting to what they experience as opposed to being ready for it. And what does it say? Oppose fascism and hierarchy. Oh yeah. So basically like what this means is we're going to oppose fascism and hierarchy, which we've been talking about the critiques of this whole time. And that includes our movements, right? And so if hierarchy is how fascism is generated, then there can't be hierarchy in your movement, or you're just going to recreate the problems that you're trying to solve. An unfortunate historical proof for the efficiency of this strategy is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, who use Deleuze and Guattari's kind of explanation of what effective resistance looks like very, very effectively in Palestine and the Gaza Strip. And unfortunately, that is how we know that this is a actual effective warfare tactic. So I guess for legal reasons, I would never advise you to use rhizomatic resistance strategies in anti-government acts. It's all abstract and academic. But if you're going to go protest and organize, we know this works. Let's use it to destroy fascism instead of to create it. Okay, the last thing that I will say about Deleuze and Guattari is the reason this is so important right now is because the US government and the police system and the military structure were all created to oppose existing power structures. Like our military was developed in response to like the existence of the Revolutionary War. We're fighting England, which has a very like set and hierarchical power. And so that's what we are built to, or like not we, but like the government and the military are built to respond to. That's how we know to do warfare. That's what our strategies are built to respond to. I think I just said that twice. But anyway, we do not have the kind of like existing logistical setup to deal with rhizomatic resistance. And this kind of comes back to the like microfascism stuff and like the epistemic addiction to sovereignty, metaphysical addiction to sovereignty, whatever it is, which is that the government cannot fight a physical war against the citizens of the US. There is not enough hard power. Like they can't nuke the US because they are invested in making sure that it is still functional and existent. And so like fighting like a land war, like you can't, there aren't enough troops to send them to every single person's house, right? Like this entire system of control and power is completely reliant on us policing ourselves. on not behaving in ways that are unpredictable, that are unintelligible, because as soon as we start doing that, as soon as we start subverting the expectations of power, there is nothing they can do. There isn't enough manpower, and they're not prepared to deal with it. And so I guess important takeaway, look into it. Think about the things that you're doing for yourself and the things that you are doing for someone else, and where did you get your values from, and how did you decide them, and what do you think makes a good person, and what did you think before, and this, that, and the other, because anarchism in thought is kind of the first step towards breaking out of the false choice and the trap of epistemic and metaphysical overdeterminism that allow power structures to decide how the world works. If you are interested in this, I am giving another talk on it in November at the PAMLA conference. So feel free to hit me up, and I will see if I can get people that video. And now the long-awaited Baudrillard, Language, Semiotics, and the Simulation. So we got a quote. I will read you this one. You think that information produces meaning. The opposite occurs. Information devours its own content, devours communication and the social. Rather than creating communication, it exhausts itself in the act of staging communication. Rather than producing meaning, it exhausts itself in the staging of meaning, excuse me. So this is kind of a classic in my, I find it to be classic. And we're looking here at the difference between information and communication. So information is the attempt to understand something, the interpretation of reality and the presentation of those things as true and real. So the act of collecting information is the act of making the world transparent, right? But that is not communication. That is a descriptive feature. It is the presentation of one understanding of reality as being correct or true or more valid than another one. And so that kind of pulls us back into the will to order, because if you're, well, give me 1 second, let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, pause on the will to order. That's gonna be on the next slide. What I wanted to say here was there is a presumed neutrality of information. The idea that there are facts and truth and that those things are not working on behalf of anyone, they're just descriptions. But information is already mediated, right? It has to be described through language. And so it can't really be neutral, or nothing can be neutral or objective, because someone had to tell it to you. Someone had to come up with it. Someone had to find it. And so that person has already interacted with that presumed fact before you reached it, before you experienced it. And so what is information but somebody else's perception of some kind of experience of reality? So some vibes. I hope y'all like my meme. I found it on the internet. But anyway, so now we're going to come back to the will to order. So these are 3 kind of foundational principles, which is funny because they've been in Deleuze and they were in Nietzsche, and now they're here in Baudrillard, and we're still talking about them. So we just talked about the will to transparency. This has to do with our attempt to use information and to collect information to describe the world in some kind of pseudo-objective sense, and that clarified understanding of the world is something that would be consumable and comprehensible and contained within knowledge and information as something that is objective. This project is impossible, right? Because the world cannot be rendered transparent in an objective way. And often in our attempt to do so, it becomes violent. And the reason for that is the will to order, which we've also talked about, right? If we're creating universal rules, if we're describing all of reality in a way that is singularly and objectively understandable, then what do we do with the people and the ideas and the practices that don't fit our transparent understanding? Well, you can refer to Deleuze. We present a false choice: fit the will to order, allow the world to be transparent, or get genocided. It's not a choice, but it's a choice so that they can say they gave you one. The other thing that we've got here, and this is kind of what Baudrillard is bringing to the table on kind of his own, is the will to meaning. The idea that something only has value if that thing is meaningful and productive, and that ability to have productive potential and value is a precondition to having any kind of to mattering. When I think this is maybe better explained in the context of, well, I always understand it in the context of disability theory. The idea that to have value as an individual, you must have meaning, you must be productive. And if you do not fit within that like predefined understanding of what those things are, then you become disposable or a victim of dehumanization or death securitization or social death, whatever it might be. It is if you do not mean, if you do not signify, if you do not have that same understanding and relationship to value as would be contained in the will to order, then, and we're back at the false choice. Either become productive or peace out. Okay. So this is actually, and I know we are getting close to the end of the initially intended hour-and-a-half time period. I only have like one real slide after this, so we might go a little over. But this is actually kind of the nexus of the Baudrillard portion of this lecture. This is the really important thing, which is before Baudrillard was a critical theorist or a philosopher or kind of an obnoxious academic, he was a linguist. And much as semiotics is very much related to language, Baudrillard and all of these like the things that people say that sound really wacky and like absurd are very much related to language. So we will start the classic, I am holding a Red Bull in my hand. And I have an infinite number of ways to describe the differences between these two things. I could say the Red Bull is blue and silver, and my hand is like beige and reddish, right? The Red Bull has splashy liquid in it. My hand has liquid in it, right? There's blood in there, but it doesn't splash when I shake my hand around, whatever. I could list these forever, and they would get increasingly absurd, but I could keep going. But there is an infinitely larger number of ways to describe these differences that I cannot use language to describe. There are things that we just don't have words for that are actual differences, but we can't say them. And so they lose relevance, right? And so we perceive really only those things that can be communicated. And I'll go into this in a second, but it is important to know that this means because, or actually no, I'll do this in the other order. So when I say that like language determines perception, I don't just mean this in like an abstract sense. I am talking about like actual like cognitive science studies that have been done. So there was an indigenous group in, I don't want to mispronounce that. I believe that says Kandoshi, but this is an indigenous group in Peru that do not have two different words for blue and green. And when shown images of the color blue and the color green, they would describe them as being the same color, right? And so that linguistic difference mediates like the perception of what color is being shown. And you can see this also with a group in Brazil called the Piraha, who do not have like counting units. They don't have numbers in their like lexicon. And so when they have a collection of objects, they're like, I don't remember exactly what process was used to like investigate this, but there isn't really like a cultural relevance to like how many of something they have. And that has to do with another thing because there's no future tense. So there's no planning and collecting of like resources. And so they don't really need to count because they've just got what they've got and they're living now, right? But then there's no real perception of quantity. And I don't remember how they tested that, right? But these things are linguistic differences. And we see these in between all languages. For instance, in English, we have a particular relationship between space and time. If I say I'm moving forward, you could see that as like physically moving forward or as moving into the future. Spanish does not have the same relationship between space and time. And they found that when they translated a whole set of English phrases that relate those two things that way from English to Spanish, that something like 95%, I have no idea how they calculated this, but 95% of intended meaning was lost. And so when I say that perception determines that perception determines reality, I do not just mean in some abstract sense. I mean physically, the language that you have to describe the world just decides what you see, what you perceive. What we decide is important enough to describe with words is what structures reality itself for the individual. And the other thing is that these differences are not static or neutral or like stable. Language is not perfect. We are all already living in a simulation because we are all mediating our own reality. Because even within like the English language, like if you get a bunch of English speakers in the room, in the same room, right? We all have different relationships to language. We all have different relationships to the pieces of language and to particular words and experiences. And so we could all read the same sentence and have completely different perceptions of them. And that is when we say that like representations fail to contain reality. That's what's being said. Okay. So the information economy. And I'll try not to spend too much time here. Well, I think this is the last. Oh, there's one slide after this. Is there one slide after this? Sorry, let me. Oh, okay. I will move through this in the next like 5-ish minutes. Anyway, so the information economy, right? So this is kind of the next major piece. We talked about what like the differences between semiotics and like Marxist understandings of capital were. So we've got the sign economy, right? That like value is transferred via like ideas. That you're not selling products anymore, you're selling experiences and brand identities. And so like this construction of the consumer is something that is constantly in relation to like ideas being sold and circulated, means that like information is like constant, it's overwhelming. We're being marketed to all the time. And we are getting just constant external stimuli to describe the world, to describe products, and that's overwhelming. And then we've got this like never-ending like news stream of people that have completely different explanations for things and completely different versions of events. And at a certain point, there's too much, and we don't know what on earth is going on anymore. We don't know what to believe. We don't know what's true. We don't even know what truth is. And I think that's a really common experience, particularly like right now in history. And so when we say information is dissuasive, that's what we mean. That like to produce more information about something does not have the ability to convince people anymore, because at this point, people are just deciding what they believe is true, and there's always a source to support it. I think debate's a great example of that. There is always an answer. There's always an article that will disagree. And you know what? I will hit framework 1,000,000 times, and I will be presented with various explanations as to why I shouldn't read chaos, and I will do it anyway, because no matter how much information you throw at me, it's dissuasive. It's not going to change my mind. Okay, so now we are going to talk about the goal 4, which is kind of another one of those like, oh, the goal 4 did not take place. What is he talking about? So what he's talking about is 2 primary things. The first is the use of the image to kind of like dictate warfare in the modern era. And the second is the process of war pornography. So when we look at September 11th, which is what the goal 4 was in response to, this is kind of a moment of humiliation for the US, right? Like it is embarrassing for us that we were like victim of this, because we're supposed to be this like global superpower with incredible military strength, and we're supposed to be this democratic, like liberal, progressive nation that everybody loves, right? And clearly neither of those things are nearly as true as we would want them to be, and as we would want people to perceive them to be. And so we need to respond. Like, what do we do now? So we try to respond, and we'll get to like what is up with that on the next slide. But we respond with an invasion. And so the first piece is we say that there are weapons of mass destruction. We simulate them, because we've come to find out later that they weren't there, and we didn't really have any reason to believe that they were, but we needed a reason to invade, because we needed a real justification to strike back. I might have my history mixed up a little bit in terms of like, but whatever it may be, we wanted to go over there anyway. We needed to get back at like the imagined figure of the terrorist. And this actually becomes a very convenient figure for us, right? Because now we have a crisis. We have something to fight. We have a justification for military expansion. We have a justification for invasion. We have a justification for the increase of use of force. And we can hide it all behind patriotism. And so we go and we do these things under the guise of liberal progressivity, and eventually we end up with the photos of the Baghdad prison, and the realization that, I mean, we can't even really pretend to be progressive, liberal, democratic leaders anymore. The like kind of torture and human rights violations that went on in those prisons is supposed to be exactly what the US wants to fight, right? Like that's why we're going there, to like be great and help people. And we're just as bad, if not worse. And we're hiding it all under this like illusion of democracy, under this illusion of striking back when threatened, when in reality, there were no WMDs. There was no like continuing threat. And here we are anyway, committing war crimes, right? And so this image becomes connected to the idea of the war itself. And it's not just this image, but like the act of like recording and photographing and like inserting into the media the war is not just like sharing information. It is the war itself, because the act of war in this case was not to create some kind of strategic advantage. It was to create an idea of the United States as a particular thing. And so the image in that way is essential, because we are creating a brand. We're selling an idea. And so the image itself cannot be connected from the war. The representation is the reality. It doesn't matter if it's true, because that's why we went there, was to create an image. And so this is kind of what Baudrillard describes as the humiliation of warfare, that it becomes degraded and almost pornographic, that it is not war anymore, but like media and news. And that like truth is no longer relevant to these things, because it is simply what we can get away with saying is true and what version of truth is most effective. Okay, so we've got the last thing. I'm sorry, charity cannibalism. That's from the last slide. Charity cannibalism being the ability to profit off of the idea of being like this great liberal power, but not actually fixing the thing. So it's like we go over there to like solve terrorism, and we don't do it. We actually very recently left the Middle East without actually doing what we said we went there to do. But for the time being where we're fighting this fight, it's like, oh yeah, look how great we are, you know, we're doing this great thing. Why would you have a problem with the US, you know? And you can see that at a less like structurally violent level in relation to like activism and disillusionment, right? So like I hear all the time from people, like, I know there are problems and I don't know what to do. I want to fix them. I want to help. And so people share infographics, or they post black screens on their, like black squares on their Instagram pages. And it really is that you're consuming the idea. You're profiting off of the idea of fixing something, of being a good activist. We're not actually fixing it, and oftentimes not even truly understanding it. People are just sharing information. But at a certain point, right, like information is dissuasive. So Baudrillard does present an answer. It is a lot more pessimistic than any of the ones we've talked about previously. There are two pieces, and I will explain them quickly. The first is death. So death is destabilizing, because it's not predictable. It's not something we can control. It's not something we can understand. It cannot be made transparent. And it is inevitable. It cannot be stamped out. And so the first piece of this is we are like, this is like fearful. This is something that is scary to people, but also to like power, because it isn't something that can be made transparent or ordered or meaningful. It just is. It's an inevitable part of existence. And that creates a securitization against death, like an attempt to ward it off, to control it as much as we can, to try and live forever. And those things are impossible, and they're violent, as per a lot of the things that we have talked about. Because in reality, like life can only have meaning in a world where it is not infinite, in a world where it will end eventually, in its proximity to death. That is life, that you generate value to life via the proximity of life to death, via the fact that it is something that will eventually go away. And so like the willingness to give it up, the image of the suicide bomber, which was Michigan KM's like kind of one of their AFs, right, is meaningful, because it is like generating value to life by putting your life at risk, by being willing to give it up for something. You are saying that like all of the value that my life has is worth this thing. The other thing though is, in the attempt to order and securitize, all of these things are done via the death of the other. We are ordering and securitizing life, and we are homogenizing it into one image of a thing that it is, so that we can understand it. And if you don't fit, you're out. But there has to be an other, because we have to justify constant, endless military expansion. And so you end up with what we talked about, the figure of the terrorist other. And so the second answer that Baudrillard provides is terrorism. So there are three pieces that you need to understand when understanding Baudrillard's definition of terrorism. And I know global is first, but I'm actually going to start with the universal. So culture is a collection of shared ideas and values. And so let's say I have a culture that thinks that this is called a peace sign. And on Wednesdays, we have to get up at 4 a.m. and shout at the stars and then go back to sleep. And physics are illegal. I really don't like physics, right? And so then I run into my friend, call out to Sam, my research partner, who I know is watching. I run into Sam, and Sam has similar values to me. We share culture, except he does not think that physics should be illegal. And so we kind of dilute the culture a little bit. And so now our culture just has these two characteristics. And then we run into another person and the culture gets diluted, and eventually it gets so big that it kind of fizzles out because it's not collective anymore. That is what Baudrillard says culture should do. That is universality. But we are not living in a universal system. We are living within the global. And the global instead would, I'll continue the analogy as if I were a global power. So I run into Sam and he's like, yeah, but I don't think physics should be illegal. And then I'm like, well, you can agree with me or I'm going to kill you and your family and everything that represents your culture. So assimilate or be exterminated. False choice, as per all of the other false choices. And so it expands in this like unnatural way where it's never diluted and it never fizzles out. And you just have this like intensity of repression where cultural values are exterminated to comply with the original ordering function of society. And that breeds discontent and eventually anger and like hopelessness and terrorism, because at a certain point you are willing to give up yourself, that your life has more value in the attempt to unseat this global power and to free the other people in your life than it does living under this kind of like ordered repression. And so the action of the terrorist in this case is punching up. You're punching at the global power. You are trying to expose it for what it is. And this operates via humiliation because the terrorist is a singularity. It is one moment. The terrorist operates alone functionally, sometimes within like small groups, but certainly not on the same level as like the US military. And institutions can't do that, right? Like an act of terrorism was committed in the US and the US could not respond with terrorism. It could only respond with military force because the global cannot generate a singularity. It can only generate like global, one thing, one kind of culture. There's no room for creativity or individuality. There's one thing. And if you don't do that one thing, you're gonna get killed, so you do it. And so the US can't respond on the terms of terrorism. And so there is only humiliation and then further humiliation when how awful our actual response mechanism was revealed. So if you're interested in this, Baudrillard's War Pornography, that's a piece that he wrote about literally this. It's very short and does a really good job of explaining what this means. So I guess the final TLDR is we should embrace terrorist singularities, question mark? And use those things to unseat power via our individuality, which we have generated by creating our own metaphysical sets and values. I think that's everything. Let me make sure. Oh, there is an analogy here, but I think we're out of time. And so questions, comments, concerns, existential anguish, anything about any of the philosophers that I talked about, any kind of vibes? All right. Well, in that case, we have an activity, I think, but are we live streaming that?
We're not going to live stream that. No. So can you make me the
yeah, I'll switch you to the.
Thank you all so much for those who are able to listen live towards the lecture. But now we're headed into the workshopping part, so putting these things into specific practice to help kind of calcify these ideas in a meaningful way. So, this is why folks register, so that they're able to have that kind of one-on-one application time. Thank you all so much. I'm going to end the live stream now. Thank you so